In 1933, a 23-year-old Swedish immigrant walked into the Lockheed Corporation with absolutely nothing to lose and everything to prove. His name was Clarence Kelly Johnson, and he was about to commit career destruction on his very first day. Most junior engineers in 1933 knew their place. They fetched coffee, nodded politely, and kept their mouths firmly shut when the senior designers spoke. Kelly Johnson looked at the company's pride and joy, the brand-new Electra airliner design, studied it for exactly 5 minutes, and delivered his professional opinion to the gray-haired veterans who'd been building aircraft since before he was born. The design was unstable. It was fundamentally flawed. It was, in his exact words, rubbish. The room went silent. The senior engineers stared at this arrogant kid who had just insulted months of their work. He had done the mathematics, run the calculations, and he knew with absolute certainty that he was right. The Electra, as designed, would kill pilots. And the horrifying truth? He was completely, devastatingly, undeniably correct. Johnson didn't just criticize the design, he fixed it. He redesigned the tail section, recalculated the stability margins, and handed Lockheed an airliner that actually worked. The Electra went on to become a legend of American aviation, flying for decades and cementing Lockheed's reputation. Clarence Kelly Johnson was born dirt poor in a frozen Michigan mining town to Swedish immigrant parents who had nothing but their hands and their stubbornness. At school, the other kids mocked his full name, Clarence Leonard Johnson, until he learned to communicate in the only language bullies understand. He fought back so hard, so relentlessly, that they stopped calling him Clarence and started calling him Kelly. The nickname stuck. So did the fighting spirit. By 1937, that same fighting spirit had already delivered the Army Air Corps something extraordinary. The generals wanted a high-altitude interceptor that could fly at 360 miles per hour and climb like a rocket. Every other aircraft company in America said it couldn't be done with one engine. Kelly looked at the problem for approximately 10 seconds and responded with 2 words. 2 engines. He designed the P-38 Lightning, a radical twin-boom monster that critics called ugly, and a monstrosity right up until the moment it screamed across the sky at over 400 miles per hour. It became the plane that shot down Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, in 1943. But success breeds new problems, and by 1943, those problems had German accents. Intelligence reports were flooding in from Europe. The Nazis had built something that shouldn't exist, the Messerschmitt Me-262, a fighter aircraft without propellers. The Germans were fighting a jet war, while America was still relying on piston engines. The United States Army Air Forces weren't just behind. They were bringing a knife to a gunfight, and everyone in the Pentagon knew it. The call came to Lockheed. They needed a jet fighter prototype, and they needed it immediately. The Air Force representatives sat down with Kelly Johnson and asked the question that would change aviation history forever. How long would it take to build? 2 years? 3 years? Johnson didn't blink. He didn't hesitate. He looked directly at the generals and delivered a number that made the room go completely silent. 180 days. It takes 180 days just to design the landing gear on a conventional aircraft. Johnson had just promised to deliver an entire operational jet fighter in the same time frame. The generals stared at him like he'd lost his mind. But Kelly Johnson had a condition, and this condition mattered more than the deadline itself. He would deliver the impossible. but only if they left him completely alone. No bureaucracy, no inspections, no interference, no committees, no reports, no generals looking over his shoulder. He would pick his team. He would pick the hours. He would pick the methods. And absolutely nobody, not one single person in a uniform or a suit, would tell him how to run his operation. The general agreed. He had no choice. America was desperate, and desperate times don't leave room for standard procedure. Lockheed was too busy building bombers to give Kelly Johnson any factory space. Every square foot of the Burbank facility was dedicated to wartime production, and there simply wasn't room for his secret jet project. Most engineers would have politely requested a delay, filed the proper paperwork, and waited for corporate approval. Kelly Johnson rented a circus tent, not a metaphor, an actual circus tent. He found an abandoned warehouse next to a plastics factory and set up shop in conditions that would make most modern engineers quit on the spot. The smell was unbearable, a toxic cocktail of burning plastic and rotting chemicals that hung in the air like a physical presence. The heat was suffocating. The noise was constant. One engineer, desperate for relief, started wearing a gas mask just to breathe without gagging. That's when the phone rang. The engineer, still wearing his gas mask, picked up the receiver and mumbled something that sounded vaguely like a greeting through the rubber filter. The person on the other end asked where they were calling. The engineer glanced around at the circus tent, the fumes, the chaos, and remembered a popular comic strip called Lil Abner that featured a moonshine factory called the Skunk Works, where hillbillies brewed illegal alcohol in the most disgusting conditions imaginable. He answered the phone with two words that would become legendary: Skunk Works. The name stuck instantly. Nobody called it the Lockheed Advanced Development Projects Division. Nobody used the official designation. It was Skunk Works, born from a gas mask and a joke about a comic strip. Johnson handpicked 23 engineers, the absolute best talent he could find. He laid down his management philosophy in what would become known as the 14 Rules, and Rule 13 was the most important. Access by outsiders strictly restricted. He created a cult of speed where only three things mattered: be quick, be quiet, be on time. The clock was ticking, and they had no margin for error. They worked 10-hour days, 6 days a week, in a tent that smelled like chemical warfare. They had no computers, no calculators, just slide rules, pencils, and the kind of focused intensity that only comes from knowing the entire free world is counting on you. Kelly Johnson was everywhere at once, checking rivets, screaming at suppliers, sweeping the floor when nobody else would. This wasn't management. This was war. On day 130, the engine finally arrived from Britain. The de Havilland Goblin, a centrifugal flow turbojet designed by Frank Halford and built on the revolutionary concepts pioneered by Frank Whittle. The British had been working on jet technology while America was still perfecting propellers, and now that British engineering was about to power the first American jet fighter into the sky. History has a funny way of connecting the dots. Day 143 arrived on a scorching California morning. That's 37 days ahead of the impossible schedule the generals thought was insane. The XP-80 Shooting Star sat on the tarmac at Muroc Dry Lake, sleek and silver and utterly unlike anything that had ever flown in American airspace. They towed it out to the desert lake bed, where the sun beat down on the fuselage like a hammer. The pilot climbed into the cockpit. The British engine whined to life with a sound that didn't belong to propellers or pistons, but to the future itself. Kelly Johnson stood by the runway, chewing on a cigar, watching the moment that would either validate everything he believed about engineering or destroy his career permanently. He had bet his entire reputation on 180 days. He had delivered in 143. The shooting star rolled down the lakebed, picked up speed, and lifted into the air with an ease that made it look simple. It flew. It didn't just fly. It screamed. America finally had a jet fighter, built in a circus tent by a bunch of rebels who ignored every rule in the book and delivered the impossible ahead of schedule. The Army brass were ecstatic. They ordered mass production immediately, and Kelly Johnson became the man who could do what nobody else could do. The war ended before the P-80 saw much combat, but the victory over Nazi Germany didn't bring peace. It just replaced one enemy with another. The Soviet Union emerged from the ruins of Europe as a nuclear-armed superpower, and by 1949, Stalin had the atomic bomb. America was flying blind. Nobody knew how many missiles the Soviets had, where they were building them, or what their actual capabilities were. The existing reconnaissance aircraft, the RB-47 and RB-57, were becoming increasingly vulnerable to Soviet surface-to-air missiles. Flying higher wasn't just an advantage, it was survival. The CIA came to Kelly Johnson with a problem that sounded physically impossible. They needed an aircraft that could fly at 70,000 feet, more than twice the altitude of commercial airliners, at the very edge of space where the sky turns black and the curvature of the Earth becomes visible. The Air Force engineers declared it couldn't be done. The air is too thin to support wings at that altitude. Physics simply wouldn't allow it. Kelly Johnson didn't argue with the physics. He redesigned the aircraft. He took the fuselage of a fighter jet and bolted on massive glider-like wings, creating something that looked more like a powered sailplane than a military aircraft. To reach that impossible altitude, every single gram mattered. He removed the armor. He removed the ejection seat system. He even removed the conventional landing gear and designed pogo wheels that fell off the moment the plane took off. To land, the pilot had to balance the aircraft on a single central bicycle wheel like a circus performer. It was dangerous. It was fragile. It was essentially a flying camera wrapped in tinfoil. He called it the CL-282. The CIA called it the U-2. The official name was Groom Lake, a prehistoric lakebed in the Nevada desert, surrounded by nothing but rocks, sand, and radiation from nearby atomic tests. The temperature regularly hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit in summer. There were no trees, no shade, no comfort of any kind. The nearest town was a dust-blown speck on a map that most people had never heard of. Workers would be living in trailers, eating canned food, and spending months in complete isolation while testing aircraft that officially didn't exist. Recruitment was going to be a nightmare. Kelly Johnson looked at this hellscape and made a decision that revealed everything you need to know about his management philosophy. He called it Paradise Ranch. The name appeared on all the recruitment materials, all the internal documents, all the official paperwork. Paradise Ranch. It conjured images of palm trees, cool breezes, comfortable accommodations. It was, without question, one of the most audacious lies in American military history, and it worked perfectly. Engineers and technicians signed up, traveled to Nevada, and arrived at what they quickly realized was the exact opposite of paradise. By then, it was too late. They were already cleared, already committed, and already standing in the middle of nowhere with a job to do. The base grew rapidly throughout the 1950s, expanding from a handful of trailers to a sprawling complex of hangars, runways, and facilities that became the most secret location in America. Security was absolute. The airspace was restricted. Even commercial pilots were forbidden from flying anywhere near the coordinates. What happened at Groom Lake stayed at Groom Lake, and the world became fascinated with the mystery. The public started calling it Area 51, after its designation on old Atomic Energy Commission maps, and the legends grew with every passing year. UFO sightings, alien technology, recovered spacecraft, government cover-ups. The truth was somehow both more mundane and more extraordinary. Area 51 was where Kelly Johnson and his Skunk Works team pushed the boundaries of what aircraft could do, testing machines that flew so high and so fast that witnesses on the ground genuinely couldn't explain what they were seeing. They weren't aliens. They were engineers. But even the best technology eventually meets its match. And on May 1st, 1960, that match arrived in the form of Soviet determination. Francis Gary Powers took off from Peshawar, Pakistan on May 1st, 1960, in U-2 number 360 for what should have been a routine reconnaissance flight over the Soviet Union. The mission was codenamed Grand Slam, and the photographic targets included ICBM launch pads at Baikonur and Plesetsk, along with the plutonium processing facility at Chelyabinsk 65. Powers climbed to 70,000 feet and crossed into Soviet airspace feeling completely safe. For 4 years, U-2 pilots had flown with impunity over the USSR. The Russians could see them on radar, but they couldn't do a single thing about it. Their fighters stalled trying to reach that altitude. Their missiles exploded harmlessly miles below. Powers was untouchable. The Soviets had been working on a solution, and on that bright May morning, they were ready. When Powers reached Sverdlovsk, deep in the Soviet heartland, the air defense forces didn't fire one missile. They fired 14 SA-2 guidelines in a massive barrage, filling the sky with explosives and shrapnel. One of the missiles detonated close enough that the shock wave hit the U-2 like a sledgehammer. Those long, delicate wings that Kelly Johnson had designed for maximum lift at extreme altitude snapped like toothpicks. The aircraft disintegrated. Powers didn't go down with his plane. He bailed out, parachuted to the ground, and was captured immediately by Soviet forces. The geopolitical catastrophe was instant and absolute. President Eisenhower had been caught red-handed conducting espionage against a nuclear superpower. The Soviets paraded Powers in front of cameras, displayed the wreckage in Gorky Park, and watched as the American government's cover story collapsed in real time. The CIA had initially claimed it was a weather research aircraft that had accidentally strayed off course. The lie lasted approximately 48 hours before Khrushchev revealed he had the pilot, the cameras, the film and photographs of Soviet military bases taken from 70,000 feet. A planned summit in Paris collapsed. U.S.-Soviet relations hit their lowest point since the Berlin crisis. Powers was sentenced to 10 years in a Soviet prison. Kelly Johnson watched the news in horror. His creation hadn't failed. Physics had simply caught up with altitude. The U-2 could fly higher than fighters, but missiles didn't need to fly. They just needed to explode close enough. And the Soviets had finally figured out how to do exactly that. The era of floating above the threat was over. If you couldn't hide up high, there was only one other option left. You had to outrun the bullet. The CIA came back to Skunk Works with a new requirement that pushed the boundaries of physics itself. They didn't need a plane that could fly higher than Soviet missiles anymore. They needed a plane that could fly faster than anything on Earth. Kelly Johnson leaned back in his chair and proposed something that sounded like science fiction. An aircraft capable of sustained flight at Mach 3 times the speed of sound, faster than a rifle bullet. A plane so impossibly fast that by the time enemy radar detected it, the aircraft would already be gone. The concept was brilliant. The engineering reality was a nightmare. At Mach 3, the friction between the aircraft and the air creates temperatures hot enough to melt aluminum. Every conventional aircraft ever built used aluminum as its primary structural material because aluminum is light, strong, and easy to work with. But at 500 degrees Celsius, aluminum turns into liquid metal. The plane wouldn't just fail, it would disintegrate mid-flight, killing the crew and scattering wreckage across whatever hostile territory it happened to be flying over at the time. Johnson needed a different material entirely, something that could withstand hellish temperatures while remaining light enough to achieve those insane speeds. Titanium was the only answer. The metal is heat-resistant, relatively lightweight, and strong enough to handle the structural stresses of Mach 3 flight. There was just one absolutely catastrophic problem. In the early 1960s, the United States didn't have anywhere near enough titanium to build even a single prototype, let alone a fleet of reconnaissance aircraft. The metal was rare, difficult to refine, and incredibly expensive. America's titanium production was a fraction of what the project required. The world's largest supplier of titanium, by an enormous margin, was the Soviet Union. The same country that had just shot down Gary Powers. The same country this new spy plane was being designed to defeat. The same enemy that America had been locked in a nuclear standoff with since 1945. The irony wasn't just rich, it was absolutely delicious. The CIA couldn't exactly call Moscow and place an order for several tons of titanium to build a Mach 3 spy plane. The Soviets would immediately figure out what was happening and cut off all exports to the United States. So the intelligence agency did what intelligence agencies do best. They lied, cheated, and created an elaborate international shell game that would have made any con artist proud. The CIA established a network of dummy corporations and front companies scattered across multiple countries. These fake businesses had fake executives, fake business plans, and very real bank accounts. One of the cover stories involved pizza ovens. American shell companies approached Soviet export agencies explaining they needed large quantities of titanium to manufacture commercial pizza ovens for the booming restaurant industry. The Soviets, apparently unfamiliar with how much titanium a pizza oven actually requires, sold them the metal without asking too many questions. Other purchases were routed through third world countries to disguise the final destination. The operation was so successful that the CIA managed to procure enough titanium to construct 32 SR-71 Blackbirds, more than a dozen A-12s, and several derivative aircraft, all using raw materials extracted from Soviet mines, processed in Soviet facilities, and sold by Soviet bureaucrats who had absolutely no idea they were funding their own surveillance. Lenin once said that the capitalists would sell the rope used to hang them. Kelly Johnson and the CIA flipped that quote on its head. The Soviets sold America the titanium used to spy on them, and they did it with a smile and an invoice. It remains one of the greatest ironies in the entire history of the Cold War, a moment of pure poetic justice that nobody could have scripted better if they tried. But acquiring the titanium was only the beginning of the challenge. Working with it was an entirely different nightmare. Titanium isn't like aluminum. You can't just cut it, weld it, and bolt it together like conventional aircraft materials. The metal is extraordinarily sensitive to contamination from even trace amounts of chlorine, fluoride, or other chemicals. Lockheed had to invent entirely new tools just to cut the material without ruining it. They had to develop new welding techniques because traditional methods left the titanium brittle and prone to catastrophic failure. Workers had to wear special gloves because the salt from human sweat could contaminate the metal and weaken the structure. Even the water used in the manufacturing process had to be specially treated. Building the SR-71 required solving problems that nobody in aviation had ever encountered before. By 1964, the first SR-71 Blackbird sat on the tarmac at Area 51, and to anyone who didn't know better, it looked fundamentally broken. Fuel was dripping from the aircraft onto the concrete in steady streams, pooling underneath the fuselage like the plane was bleeding to death. Engineers from other companies who saw it assumed Lockheed had screwed up the fuel tank seals. How could you possibly put an aircraft into service that leaked fuel on the ground? It looked like a billion-dollar disaster, a beautiful piece of engineering ruined by sloppy manufacturing. Kelly Johnson stood next to his creation and smiled, because every single drop of leaking fuel was exactly according to plan. The SR-71 was designed to fly at speeds exceeding 2,000 miles per hour at altitudes above 80,000 feet. At those speeds, the friction between the aircraft's skin and the atmosphere generates temperatures hot enough to cook food. The titanium skin heats to 500 degrees Celsius, and when metal gets that hot, it expands. If Johnson had built the fuel tanks tight and sealed on the ground, the expansion at operational temperature would rip the aircraft apart from the inside. Rivets would pop, panels would buckle. The entire structure would tear itself to pieces. So he built it loose. The panels were designed with gaps between them when the aircraft was cold and stationary. The fuel tanks were deliberately constructed to leak at ground temperature. The SR-71 only sealed itself properly when it reached operational speed, and the metal expanded to fill those carefully calculated gaps. The plane had to get hot before it could work correctly. It had to scream across the sky at Mach 3 before all the pieces fit together the way they were meant to. On the ground, it looked like a mistake. In the air, at speed, with the skin glowing hot and the panels expanded, it became perfect. The pilots who flew the Blackbird didn't wear standard flight suits. They wore full-pressure suits, essentially space suits, because at 80,000 feet their blood would boil if the cockpit lost pressure. They flew at the edge of space where the sky turned dark purple and stars became visible in daylight. At Mach 3, the aircraft moved so fast that it outran the rotation of the Earth itself. Pilots could watch the sun set in the west, turn the plane around, and watch the same sun rise again in the east. Physics became optional. But the most beautiful part of Kelly Johnson's design wasn't the speed, or the altitude, or the exotic materials. It was the operational doctrine he built into the aircraft, a solution so elegant that it redefined what invincibility meant. The standard operating procedure for an SR-71 pilot when surface-to-air missiles were detected was the simplest protocol in military aviation history. There were no evasive maneuvers, no complex defensive tactics, no chaff dispensers or electronic countermeasures or elaborate escape plans. The pilot received the missile warning, glanced at the threat display, and executed a single action that required approximately 2 seconds of effort. Push the throttle forward. That's it. That was the entire defensive strategy. Just accelerate. The SR-71 would surge from Mach 3 to Mach 3.2, sometimes higher if the engines were feeling cooperative, and the missile chasing it would enter a race it was mathematically incapable of winning. Surface-to-air missiles travel at their maximum velocity from the moment of launch. They carry a finite amount of solid rocket fuel that burns for a specific duration, and once that fuel is exhausted, they become expensive ballistic objects following a predetermined trajectory until gravity drags them back to Earth. The missile couldn't speed up. It couldn't adjust its acceleration mid-flight. It just had to hope it could close the distance before running out of energy. The SR-71, on the other hand, was already moving faster than most missiles could travel, and it could still accelerate. By the time the Soviet SA-2 or SA-5 missile reached the altitude where the Blackbird was flying, it had already burned most of its fuel climbing through the atmosphere. The missile would detect the target, adjust its trajectory, and begin the intercept, while the SR-71 simply pulled away. The closing speed dropped. The distance increased. The missile's engine flamed out, and the weapon tumbled harmlessly back toward the ground, while the Blackbird continued its mission as if nothing had happened. Over the course of the SR-71's operational lifetime, more than 4,000 missiles were fired at Blackbirds during reconnaissance missions over hostile territory. Soviet air defense networks, North Korean missile batteries, Libyan SAM sites. Every enemy who detected the aircraft and believed they had a chance to bring it down launched everything they had at the distinctive black shape screaming across their radar screens. The success rate of those 4,000-plus missiles was exactly 0. Not a single SR-71 was ever hit by enemy fire. Not once. The aircraft was untouchable, not because of stealth or luck or sophisticated defensive systems, but because Kelly Johnson had built something so fast that bullets simply couldn't catch it. The Blackbird flew operational missions from Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, RAF Mildenhall in England, and various other forward operating locations around the world. The crews logged more than 11,000 hours at speeds above Mach 3, completing over 3,500 missions in some of the most hostile airspace on the planet. They photographed Soviet naval facilities, monitored North Korean military movements, documented Libyan terrorist camps, and gathered intelligence that shaped American foreign policy throughout the Cold War. The aircraft served from 1966 until its final retirement in 1999, outlasting the Soviet Union itself. But building and operating the most advanced aircraft in history required a management philosophy that was every bit as radical as the engineering, and Kelly Johnson's approach to leadership was exactly as uncompromising as everything else he touched. Kelly Johnson ran Skunk Works like a benevolent dictatorship, where the only vote that mattered was his, and the only rule that couldn't be broken was excellence. Engineers who worked for him described the experience as simultaneously the most rewarding and most terrifying period of their careers. Johnson had a ritual that became infamous throughout the aerospace industry, a management technique so direct and so brutal that it acquired its own name. The Nickel Tour. When an engineer made a significant mistake, Kelly Johnson didn't schedule a meeting to discuss it. He didn't send a memo or file a report with human resources. He walked directly to the engineer's desk, pulled a nickel from his pocket, flipped it onto the workspace, and delivered a sentence that contained exactly 8 words. "Call your wife and tell her you're fired." The engineer had approximately 5 minutes to clear out their belongings and leave the facility. There were no appeals, no second chances, no lengthy explanations. Incompetence wasn't tolerated, mediocrity wasn't acceptable, and mistakes that resulted from laziness or carelessness were career-ending events. But here's what made Johnson different from every other tyrannical boss in corporate America. He was just as ruthless with the people trying to interfere with his team. When Air Force generals attempted to impose additional oversight on Skunk Works projects, Johnson threw them out of his office. When Pentagon bureaucrats demanded extra reports or compliance with regulations that would slow down production, he refused and dared them to fire him. When defense contractors tried to underbid Lockheed on projects, Johnson went directly to the decision-makers and explained exactly why his team would deliver better results than anyone else. And if they didn't believe him, They were welcome to fail with somebody cheaper. He built a wall around his engineers that kept out every distraction, every political consideration, every corporate mandate that didn't directly contribute to building better aircraft faster. His team loved him for it. They knew that if they performed at the highest level, if they met deadlines and solved impossible problems and delivered results that nobody else could match, Kelly Johnson would protect them from everything and everyone. He created the 14 rules of management that became legendary in engineering circles, and rule number 12 captured everything he believed about how projects should work. There must be mutual trust between the military and the contractor. Rule number 13 was even simpler. Access by outsiders strictly restricted. The engineers who survived working for Kelly Johnson went on to become legends themselves. They built the U-2, the SR-71, and laid the groundwork for stealth technology that would define the next generation of military aviation. Ben Rich, Johnson's protege, took over Skunk Works after Kelly's retirement and continued the tradition of radical innovation without bureaucratic interference. The culture Johnson created lasted decades beyond his departure. But culture requires pressure to maintain itself, and when the pressure disappeared, so did Kelly Johnson. Kelly Johnson retired from Skunk Works in 1975 after designing more than 40 aircraft and winning every major aviation award in existence. He had advised presidents, revolutionized aerospace engineering, and built machines that redefined what was physically possible. By any reasonable measure, he should have enjoyed a comfortable retirement surrounded by admirers and accolades. Instead, he slowly faded away. Without the impossible deadlines, without the pressure of building something nobody believed could exist, without the smell of jet fuel and the sound of engineers arguing over calculations, Kelly Johnson had nothing left to fight for. He watched as the aviation industry became exactly what he had spent his career fighting against. Projects that should have taken months dragged on for years. Aircraft development became buried under layers of bureaucracy, committees, and risk-averse management. The new generation of military programs required a decade of planning before a single prototype flew. Kelly Johnson had built the P-80 in 143 days using a circus tent and a slide rule. Modern aerospace contractors needed 20 years and billions of dollars to accomplish what he did in less than 5 months. He once told an interviewer that he would design an airplane for anyone, but he wouldn't suffer fools. In retirement, surrounded by fools and unable to design anything, he simply stopped. The SR-71 Blackbird continued flying long after its creator stepped away, conducting reconnaissance missions throughout the 1980s as the Cold War entered its final phase. The aircraft remained unmatched, unchallenged, and utterly dominant in its role. No other plane could touch its speed, its altitude, or its mission success rate. But by 1990, satellite technology had advanced to the point where unmanned reconnaissance platforms could do much of what the Blackbird did, and the cost of maintaining such a complex aircraft became harder to justify. The Air Force made the decision to retire the fleet. On March 6, 1990, SR-71A serial number 64-17972 took off from Los Angeles for its final operational flight. The destination was Washington, D.C., specifically the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, where the aircraft would be permanently displayed. The crew, Lieutenant Colonel Ed Yielding and Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Vida, had one last chance to demonstrate what the Blackbird could do. They flew the 2,300 miles from coast to coast in 64 minutes and 20 seconds, reaching speeds above Mach 3.2 and setting records that still stand today. When they landed at Dulles International Airport, they taxied directly to the museum grounds, shut down the engines for the final time, and climbed out of the cockpit. The flight log was handed to museum officials with the ink still wet on the final entry. Kelly Johnson passed away on December 21, 1990, less than 10 months after the SR-71's final flight. He was 80 years old, and he had lived just long enough to see his greatest creation retire alongside him. It was as if he and the Blackbird were tied together by some invisible string, bound by something deeper than engineering or physics. When the bird stopped flying, the master stopped breathing. The aircraft that couldn't be caught and the man who refused to slow down both reached the end of their operational lives within the same year. Kelly Johnson didn't just build planes, he built the future, and he did it in a circus tent with a slide rule and a promise. Be quick, be quiet, be on time. Those 3 rules defined everything he created, every impossible deadline he met, every aircraft that shouldn't have worked but flew anyway. The Skunk Works continues to operate today, still building classified projects in conditions of absolute secrecy, still following the management philosophy that Kelly Johnson established more than 80 years ago. His legacy isn't just the aircraft, it's the proof that bureaucracy is optional, that speed matters more than process, and that one person with vision and the courage to ignore every rule can change the world. The SR-71 Blackbird sits in the Smithsonian now, suspended from the ceiling, where millions of visitors stare up at it every year and wonder how something that impossibly fast could have been built in the 1960s. The answer is simple. Kelly Johnson didn't wait for permission, didn't accept limitations, and didn't care what the experts said was impossible. He just built it.